Welcome to the Book Review Podcast. Today we're diving into a concept that, well, once you understand it, it can really shift how you approach pretty much everything. We're talking biggest business challenges, smallest daily habits, you name it. Our source for this deep dive is Richard Koch's really influential book, The 80-20 Principle, The Secret to Achieving More with Less. We're here to pull out the most impactful insights for you, give you that shortcut to being well-informed, and maybe, just maybe, reveal some surprising truths along the way.
That's exactly right. Our mission today is, well, it's to unpack the core ideas of this principle. We'll trace its really fascinating historical journey. I mean, it started as this obscure economic observation and kind of became a universal law. We'll explore how it plays out in various contexts, some quite counterintuitive, actually. And most importantly, discover how you can apply it to your own life, your own work, to make a truly significant impact. It's about learning to leverage the hidden rules of the universe, for your own ends, not just watching them happen.
Okay, let's unpack the core idea first. I mean, many of you might already know the 80-20 principle, or the Pareto Principle, as it's also called. But for anyone new to it, or just as a quick refresher, at its heart, it basically says there's this inherent imbalance, an imbalance between causes and results, or inputs and outputs, effort and reward. Typically, a small minority, often around, say, 20% of causes or inputs or effort, leads to the major impact, the dominant impact, usually around 80% of the results or rewards. So what is it about this imbalance? Why do we see it everywhere, from economics to, well, our daily habits?
That's a really big question. And it's crucial to understand that 80-20, it isn't some exact, rigid mathematical rule you'll find everywhere. The actual numbers, they might vary a lot sometimes. You might see 70-20 or 80-15 or, even something extreme like 9-91. The fundamental point is the unbalanced nature of the relationship. It's far, far from a 50-50 split. Think of it as a significant disparity. A small fraction accounts for the lion's share of the vast majority of the outcome. And a critical point here, especially for analysis. For this principle to really apply, you need two distinct sets of data, and each set has to add up to 100%, and they have to be causally linked somehow. So you couldn't, for example, just say, 80% of people are right-handed and call that an 80-20 observation. That's just one set of data. You need interconnected sets, like, say, the percentage of people and the percentage of wealth they hold. That connects.
Okay. That distinction really clarifies things. Makes sense. So where did this idea, this erratic block, as one economist apparently called it, where did it first come from? It actually started way back, 1897, with an Italian economist, Vilfredo Pareto. He was looking at patterns of wealth and income. This was in 19th century England. And he made this striking discovery. There was a consistent mathematical relationship where a small minority of people held most of the wealth. And he found this pattern, this imbalance, repeated itself consistently across different times, different countries.
And that erratic block, it just kept resurfacing in really unexpected places. Other pioneers picked up on it later. Like in 1931, there was Professor Zip. He applied this unbalanced pattern to all sorts of diverse data sets. He even analyzed marriage licenses in Philadelphia from like a 20-block area. Get this, he found 70% of the marriages happened between people living within 30% of the total distance involved. And, for all of us whose desks might look a bit chaotic, Zip even used this logic to scientifically justify the messy desk. Things you use often tend to get pulled closer. Makes sense, right? Then, fast forward to 1951, Joseph Juran. He was a key figure in the quality revolution, especially over in Japan. He actually coined the terms Pareto Principle and Rule of the Vital Few, made it central to the whole quest for high product quality and efficiency.
And the tech world really grabbed onto this, didn't they? I remember reading about IBM in 1963. They discovered that about 80% of a computer's time, its processing time, was spent executing only 20% of its operating code, just a tiny fraction of the code. So they immediately rewrote their software to make that crucial 20% super accessible, super user-friendly. And it dramatically improved efficiency and speed.
Precisely. And that thinking, it profoundly influenced the next wave, the personal computing giants. Apple, Lotus, Microsoft. They applied the 80-20 principle with, well, even more gusto, you could say. Made their machines cheaper, easier to use, opened them up to a whole new, much wider customer base. We also see this pattern in modern society. It's often called the winner-take-all effect. You see this astonishing concentration of wealth and income go into a tiny fraction of superstars, at the very top of many professions, like the top 1% of U.S. earners. Their earnings soared by something like 57% just between 1990 and 2004. It's huge. It really suggests that unless you have conscious, sustained efforts to counter it, the 80-20 principle, or even more extreme versions like 991, it just keeps reasserting itself.
This brings up a really fascinating question, doesn't it? If this pattern is so widespread, what's the underlying logic? What does Richard Koch suggest in the book about why the universe seems to operate with this built-in imbalance?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. Koch, in the book, he really brings this home by connecting the principle to chaos theory. Both of them basically assert that the universe is fundamentally unbalanced. It's nonlinear. Cause and effect. They're rarely linked in an equal proportionate way. One unit in doesn't mean one unit out. Yet despite its name, chaos theory doesn't mean everything is just random mess. It's more like there's a self-organizing logic hiding behind the apparent disorder. The economist Paul Krugman called it a predictable nonlinearity. This often gets explained by feedback loops, where small initial influences can just get multiplied hugely. Think about goldfish in a pond. Okay, maybe they start almost the same size. But the ones with just a tiny initial advantage, maybe slightly better propulsion, slightly bigger mouth, they quickly become much, much bigger.
Right.
Why? Because they can gobble up a disproportionate amount of the food. That small age snowballs.
Wow, that goldfish example really brings it to life. It's so clear. So if small advantages can snowball like that, what does that mean for us? If we're trying to create a tipping point in our own lives or businesses.
Well, it connects directly to that concept, the tipping point, which actually comes from epidemic theory. It describes that point where, small efforts yield very little progress for a while. But then, if a new force or idea keeps going and crosses some kind of invisible line, suddenly a small amount of additional effort can reap huge returns. Boom. It's like when a low-level flu outbreak suddenly turns into a crisis because just enough people are infected to spread it really rapidly. This nonlinear behavior means tiny changes can have massive effects if they're applied at the right moment. But you have to understand where that invisible line might be.
And it's not just about what happens now, right? It's also about what happened first. That's a concept that really makes you stop and think about past decisions, doesn't it?
Indeed. Chaos theory also brings in this idea of sensitive dependence on initial conditions. Basically, the idea that what happens first, even if it seems totally trivial at the time, can have a huge disproportionate effect later on. A small lead early in a market, for instance, can translate into a massive dominant position for a company way down the line. Think about driving on the right versus the left side of the road, or why clocks usually move clockwise. These are pretty much arbitrary initial conditions. But once a slight majority adopted them, maybe just by chance, they became the dominant, almost universal convention. It's all about those initial, often seemingly insignificant choices having these outsized long-term impacts.
It's incredible how deeply ingrained this principle seems to be. Once you start looking for it, you really do see the 80-20 principle everywhere. In business, it's widely validated. Like you said, 20% of products often account for 80% of sales or profits, and the same often goes for customers.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in society, the patterns are just as striking, sometimes even more so. Like data suggests 20% of criminals are responsible for 80% of the value of all crime, or that 20% of motorists cause 80% of accidents. It's quite consistent. And even at home, right, it plays out. 20% of your carpets probably get 80% of the wear and tear. And I bet 20% of your clothes get worn 80% of the time. My own closet definitely confirms that one.
Mine too. But here's a really surprising one from the book. The internal combustion engine. Apparently, 80% of the energy from the fuel is actually wasted in combustion, just lost as heat, mostly. Only 20% actually gets to the wheels to make the car move. Yet that tiny 20% of the input generates 100% of the output. The car moves. It's kind of a testament to the principle, right? Even massive inefficiency can still produce the full desired outcome if the right 20% is working. So, okay, how do we actually apply this in the real world, especially in business? Koch makes this distinction between 80-20 analysis, which is precise, quantitative, fact-based, and 80-20 thinking, which is fuzzier, more qualitative, insight-driven. Where do we even begin?
Right. Well, when we come to 80-20 analysis, let's maybe go back to a relatable example. Beer drinkers. Okay, imagine you have 100 friends who sometimes drink beer. An 80-20 analysis might show that, say, 70% of the beer consumed last week was drunk by just 20% of those friends. You're heavy users. Now, if you're a brewery, knowing this tells you exactly who to target for promotion, for product feedback. It's those heavy users, not the ones who have one beer a month. This kind of strategic application can really pinpoint where to focus improvement efforts, like traffic authorities. They could focus their limited resources on just the 20% of intersections that cause 80% of the traffic jams. Instead of trying to tweak every single traffic light in the city, it's about leverage, putting your resources where they'll have the biggest impact.
But you have to be careful, right, not to apply this too simplistically.
Yeah.
In a straight line, the book gives a great example from the book trade. It's easy to show that maybe 20% of book titles make up 80% of sales. So you might think, great, let's just stock the bestsellers, cut the rest. But apparently, when bookstores restrict their range based only on titles sold, profits often go down. What's happening there?
Yeah, it's a subtle trap, isn't it? It feels logical, but it's wrong. The key isn't just the distribution of sales, it's the distribution of profits. Where does the actual money come from? The true bestsellers, profit-wise, aren't always the hot new releases that get all the buzz. They're often the reliable core inventory books, the ones that sell steadily year after year, often with better margins, and without needing huge marketing campaigns. So yeah, you need to be selective, maybe even a bit contrarian. Look beyond just the surface metrics to what truly generates value. It's easy for organizations to kind of accidentally generate complexity, not maliciously, but maybe because it feels busy, it expands departments, feels like growth, even while it's quietly destroying actual value and profit.
And Corning is such a great example of simplifying for profit. That story is amazing. They had these two ceramic substrate products, right? The R10, which was easy to make, almost made itself, and the R5, this low-volume, weirdly shaped thing. On paper, the standard cost for the R5 was only 20% more than the R10. Seems okay. But when they actually dug into it, factored in all the extra engineering time, the special handling, the R5 was an incredible 500,000% costlier than the R10. 500,000%. That's just wild.
It's astounding, isn't it? And by getting rid of products like the R5, these low-volume, super unprofitable items, Corning cut its engineering capacity needs by 25%, and profits were quickly restored. It was just a crystal clear case of less was more. They realized that value was being destroyed by clinging to this idea of a complete product line instead of focusing on the core profit drivers.
Okay, shifting gears slightly to marketing and sales. The book lays out these, 3 golden rules for 80/20 marketing. What are they? First, focus on providing a truly stunning product or service, but within the top 20% of your existing line. The part that's already generating 80% of your profits. Don't spread yourself thin. Second, to devote extraordinary effort, really go above and beyond, to delighting and keeping the 20% of customers who provide 80% of your sales or profits. And third, recognize that real innovation is always product-led. You can't just market your way out of a mediocre product in the long run.
And practically speaking, to hook the right customers, you first have to really know who your top 20% are. Identify them. Then, provide outrageous service to them. Service so good it actually surprises them, goes way beyond what anyone else in the industry is doing. Third, target new products and services specifically for these core customers. Maybe even involve them in developing those new things. And finally, you strive to keep them forever. Make extraordinary efforts to retain them because their loyalty is directly, massively tied to your long-term profitability. Think about those radio stations that figured out their core listeners spent way more hours tuned in. They focused everything on milking every extra quarter hour they could from those listeners.
This totally applies to your sales force too, doesn't it? It's highly likely, almost certain, that 80% of your sales come from just 20% of your salespeople. So what are the actionable strategies? How do you leverage that imbalance?
Yeah, the strategies are pretty clear, actually. First, retain those high performers at all costs. And it's not just about money. It's about keeping them challenged, happy, feeling valued. Second, hire more people like your top performers. Try to figure out what makes them successful and replicate it. Reverse engineer their success. Third, identify when your top salespeople sell the most. What are they doing differently during those peak times? Can others learn from that? And don't be afraid to strategically switch successful sales teams. Move them to underperforming areas and see if they can crack the code there. Even when it comes to sales training, the 80/20 approach suggests focusing 80% of your training effort and resources on the best 20% of your trainees, the ones with the most potential, rather than trying to bring everyone up to the same average level.
Right. Focus the resources. And beyond these core areas like marketing and sales, the 80/20 principle just keeps popping up in other critical business functions, like decision making. It implies you should identify the few decisions that really matter, and when something is working well, double down, redouble your bets. Like Filofax, remember them. They found huge success by cutting hundreds of exotic binder variants to just focus on their core, most profitable ones. In inventory management, it's about optimizing for the 20% of items that account for 80% of warehouse movement or value. For project management, it suggests stooping projects down to their one simple core aim, recognizing that 80% of a project's real value probably comes from just 20% of the activities. And even negotiation, understanding that only a few points really matter in the end, and often 80% of the concessions get made in the final 20% of the negotiation time. It really is everywhere you look in business. Okay, so let's bring it home. What does all this mean for you, the listener, in your personal life? The book suggests this principle can lead to, well, nothing short of a time revolution. That sounds pretty dramatic.
It absolutely can be. The book argues pretty strongly that most of your significant achievements, and also most of your happiness, they occur in a small minority of your time. The issue isn't usually a shortage of time itself, it's how that time is spent, how it's allocated. So the invitation here is to really reflect on and then consciously nurture the most precious 20% of your life, the parts that yield the most value, the most joy. Think about famously effective people who seemed almost lazy, like Ronald Reagan, who achieved enormous political success without being a workaholic. Or Warren Buffett became one of the richest men in the world primarily by investing wisely, focusing on a few core insights, not by working insane hours managing companies day to day. They found their vital few activities and multiplied them.
And what about happiness? That feels less quantifiable. The book argues it's actually a duty, something you owe yourself, and that it can be cultivated. How does 80/20 fit in there?
Well, it emphasizes the importance of emotional intelligence, EQ, over pure IQ when it comes to happiness, which makes sense. And it suggests cultivating daily happiness habits, focusing on the few things that give you the biggest boost. Things like, regular exercise, mental stimulation, learning something new, maybe spiritual or artistic stimulation too, doing good turns for others, consciously taking pleasure breaks with friends, treating yourself now and then, and maybe at the end of the day actually taking a moment to congratulate yourself on your efforts, focusing on the positive. It's about consciously choosing habits that boost happiness and recognizing a few key ones deliver most of the impact.
Okay, and relationships. That's a big one for personal life. The principle seems to suggest fewer and deeper might be the way to go for both personal connections and professional alliances.
Exactly. You should try to identify your vital few relationships, the ones that provide most of your emotional support, your professional value, your joy. The strongest relationships, according to Koch, they're built on 5 key things: mutual enjoyment, respect, shared experience, reciprocity. They give and take and trust. So the advice is really to choose your mentors, your close peers, very carefully. Make sure those key relationships are truly bilateral, truly enriching for both sides. It's about consciously investing your limited social energy in the relationships that matter most, rather than spreading yourself too thin across many superficial ones.
And for career success, the principle is incredibly pointed. It really urges us to specialize, doesn't it?
It does, strongly. It encourages specializing in a very small niche. Something you enjoy, but also something where you can genuinely excel and become a recognized leader. Stand out. The core idea here is that focused knowledge is power in the modern economy. You need to identify your core customers, and even if you're an employee, you can think about who really values your output the most. Who are you serving? And then focus on serving them exceptionally well. The book even suggests that becoming self-employed is often the best route to capture more of the value you personally create. And once you are self-employed, you can leverage the 80/20 principle further by employing other people who are net value creators and strategically outsourcing everything except your core high-value skills.
Makes sense. And finally, for your money and investments, you mentioned 80/20 applies there too. What are Koch's key takeaways for managing finances?
It definitely applies. Money tends to follow that same unbalanced distribution. Wealth concentrates. Richard Koch offers, I think it's 10 investment commandments in the book. Key ones include: invest mainly in the stock market, equities, for the long term. Don't try to time it too much. Invest most heavily when the market is low. When sentiment is poor, be contrarian. Systematically cull your loss makers. Sell a stock if it falls, say, 15% from the price you paid. Cut your losses. And crucially, run your gains. Let your winners ride. There's a quote, never sell Glaxo, meaning don't cut your big winners short just to lock in a profit. The principle suggests that for most individual portfolios, 80% of the gains over time will likely come from just 20% of the investments. So you have to identify and hold on to those winners.
Okay. Now, it's really important we acknowledge that the 80/20 principle isn't, without its critics or nuances. And the book does address these. Like, is the unproductive 80% really just waste? Or is it somehow necessary for balance, for renewal? Does the book explore times when that unproductive 80% actually serves a hidden vital purpose?
Yes, absolutely. This is where that yin and yang perspective really comes in. It's not all ruthless efficiency. Some critics, like the amusingly named Chao-Ching Cornholio mentioned in the book, argue that you actually enjoy the productive 20% yang activity because you're released from the 80% yin activity. The downtime makes the uptime valuable. Think of that British ambassador anecdote. He spent a lot of time on seemingly trivial social events, building relationships. But that time was absolutely invaluable in a crisis because he knew exactly who to call, who to trust. That unproductive time built crucial context and judgment. So the book contrasts efficiency, where maybe corner cutting is okay for basic hygiene factors with life enhancement. The poetry of life, where depth, maybe even taking the longest route, is actually preferred, is not always about optimization at all costs.
That makes a lot of sense. And there's also a powerful point about sustainability, isn't there? If you just focus ruthlessly on exploiting only the top 20% of the most productive resources, say the best fishing waters, you might actually deplete the entire resource, because those super productive areas are often also the breeding grounds, right? So this implies a long-term view is absolutely crucial. And maybe real opportunities are hidden in that seemingly unprofitable 80% that could be vital for future growth or just resilience. It's not just about today's yield.
Precisely. So at the end of the day, the principle is best seen as a diagnostic tool, a lens. It's not a rigid prescriptive rule for every situation. The goal isn't necessarily to ruthlessly eliminate everything but the top 20% in all aspects of life. It's more about consciously applying the insight to increase your effectiveness, your happiness, your impact. It's about finding the right balance for you, where your work, your effort truly becomes, as Koch puts it, more fun than fun, because you're focusing your energy on what genuinely matters most to you and yields the greatest results.
So maybe to bring it all together, here's a final thought to reflect on. This profound idea that progress, both for us personally and maybe for society, isn't necessarily about doing more. It's about intelligently identifying and then multiplying the truly impactful few things, while also discerning what is truly essential and what isn't. It's really about choosing where to focus your finite energy for those disproportionate returns and recognizing that this choice, it isn't a one-time thing. It's an ongoing, evolving dance with the world's inherent, unavoidable imbalances. Thanks for listening to the Book Review Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a comment. See you next time.